Everyone, my name is Thor Gunnarsson. I am one of the co-founders at Solfar Studios. We are a Icelandic pure VR studio, founded a couple of years ago by three ex-CCP guys, the former founder of CCP and our creative director Reynir, and Kjartan, who was the lead game designer on EVE Online back in the day, and CCP's principal game designer for a number of years. We're a reasonably established early team, 12 people strong. We've raised some venture financing, good backers out of the Nordics and China and Iceland. We're basically trying to innovate, create, experiment, fail, learn, to create kind of the standout core games and experiences that will hopefully establish a couple of good benchmarks in the early days of VR. Today I want to talk about our first commercial project, Everest VR. This is a VR experience that we shipped on HTC Vive, on Steam, and Viveport last year. Next week we're actually launching on Oculus with gamepad and touch support, and PlayStation VR is coming this quarter, so we're in kind of closing stages on development there. And Everest is sort of a interesting project. It is not a game. It is very much about kind of taking the kind of key strengths of VR and creating something that is very experiential, created in a game engine, so it's a synthetic environment, not 360 video, etc., but something that is really in the non-gaming kind of experiential category. And when we set out to think about our first project, we thought, how are we going to actually create something into a market with an install base of 0 or less than 1 million, call it. Create something that we can develop in 6 to 9 months, ideally, and for a budget that is extremely indie in terms of cost, but deliver something that is really a AAA, very high quality experience that kind of punches above its weight in terms of the visual immersion and the sense of presence that the experience delivers. So today I'm going to talk about kind of our production methodology, how we created Everest, some of the technical approaches we took. And the kind of first observation, if you're thinking about VR development, is figure out the hack to cut your budget. The most conventional way is using royalty-free assets. So from the likes of Turbo Squid, super high quality assets that are royalty-free, very inexpensive, and allow you to actually develop something with very high visual quality, assuming you've got a good technical art team, art director, etc., that can really light and kind of stage the scene based on very cheap art. So that's the key thing if you're thinking about doing a VR project in the early days. Our approach with Everest VR was a little bit different. We have a really good friend in Iceland who is the creative director and founder of a visual effects studio called RVX. Ex-Framestore guy, 20 years in the Hollywood VFX and animation industry. When we founded Solfar, we had like 10 different concepts, what we thought would be a good first project. We saw what Daði and his team were doing with the visual effects for the film Everest. That was directed actually by an Icelandic director. We saw the early kind of work that they were doing to create a CGI version of Mount Everest for the film, and we thought, hey, Daði, let's get this asset and figure out if we could repurpose and kind of retask it to actually run in real time in an engine like Unreal 4. We set about doing that, and I'm just going to show you briefly the basic results visually if you haven't had a chance to look at the project. So this is actually a video, obviously, but this is rendering real time in Unreal 4. This was an early technical test where we took the original asset from the film production and actually repurposed it, kind of recalculated the whole asset to make it run in real time. And a lot of people assume that this is actually principal photography from the film, but this is running at 90 hertz on HTC Vive and now on new platforms. So how did we go about doing this? Well, we used a technique called stereophotogrammetry, and Chet from Valve was talking about this yesterday. Valve have done some great work in this area, and stereophotogrammetry is the other hack in terms of production. So if you have a concept for a game or an experience that is near photoreal, then photogrammetry is an amazing way to actually acquire a real-world environment, and then set it up and script it and create a game or an experience based on that technology. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. How do we go about doing this? Well, we all know the constraints of VR. The min spec is pretty unforgiving. I mean, we have to run on an NVIDIA 970 and probably even lower now in terms of some of the min spec changes that are happening on the platforms. and we have to run at 90 hertz locked at 1.5 HD resolution, which is a pretty hard task. You're doing something that, a AAA game doesn't have to labor under, but we have to run this, solidly at that frame rate. When we set out doing the project, obviously Dale and his team at RVX had done the visual supervision for the film, and we saw what they were doing in stereophotogrammetry. We knew that this was a way to do something in real time, so we actually took the underlying asset, the work product that they created for some of the visual effects shots, and used stereophotogrammetry to actually recalculate the mountain so that could run in real time. And if you're not familiar with stereophotogrammetry, it's basically the principle of taking a lot of conventional photographs, 2D photographs, from 2 or more vantage points of the same area, and then using a software pipeline to actually calculate the 3D XYZ coordinates and generating the point cloud for the mountain itself, in our case. This is Dale actually at base camp. He was basically there a few years ago doing principal photography and capturing the actual landscape. And I want to show you guys what that looked like in practice. So beautiful shots. These are actual photographs from Everest, Kumbo Icefall, etc. This is Dale hanging out of a helicopter between Camp 2 and Camp 1 and base camp. So he's flying in a helicopter, hanging out of it, tethered into it, shooting thousands of photographs as he went along, and basically getting the source data that was used to actually then create the CGI asset of the mountain. Yeah, never going to do this. But amazing footage from the original capture. So we actually used a bespoke pipeline from a company in Iceland called Designing Reality. It's a proprietary pipeline that's been used for a lot of very high-end, Hollywood visual effects stereophotogrammetry work. But there are a number of off-the-shelf packages that you can use. Capturing Reality is another company. Agisoft is kind of the most common, kind of inexpensive software package to do this. In our case, we went a little bit hardcore. So we basically built a supercomputer, 28 cores, 128 gig RAM, 6 GeForce Titan X's in an SLI configuration. If you're into graphics and GPU compute, that kind of thing, this was pretty insane. 30,000 pictures as a source archive, 105 gigapixels in the actual point cloud that was generated by the pipeline, and many months of actual computing time to do this. We ended up with 1.5 trillion polygons in the original mesh. Like, there's no way in hell that runs in real time, right? So what do? We actually split the asset into 126 patches. Each of those was about 15 million polygons. So we had now the geometry and the mesh. We reduced that down to about 24 million. We did, bake the normal maps at a lower LOD, obviously. And then we did some close-up scenes that, were done manually in terms of some of the first-person interactions. But this is basically, the source asset of Everest. So you're looking at the kind of point cloud here, and you can see that this is incredibly detailed. And so the first step we took was obviously generating the LODs. So we used Simplygon, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Great package, kind of the de facto standard for LOD generation. And we created basically 5 different LOD levels, ranging from 130,000 triangles to about 7,000 in terms of things that were in the far distance. And this, that you can see sort of the process here of how the simplification worked to generate something that could actually render. We use standard Unreal Engine, our preferred engine. Love what the Epic guys are doing. If you're getting into VR development, the big win with Unreal, aside from a great renderer and modern pipeline and so on, is actually Blueprint, which is the visual scripting language. It means that you have fewer programmers that are needed to actually script an experience or a game. And it's a major accelerator in terms of development. We went a little further and actually added some things to Unreal. I mean, we used basically the Megatrain approach that we have in Unreal. You can see sort of the high resolution asset there, and then lower resolution models of the Himalayas around it for the far view. And you can see how the patches were basically laid out. So 126 patches in total, 8K textures each patch, 24 gigabytes. So that's not going to run in real time. So what did we do then? We found these guys in Belgium who are awesome. If you need texture compression or texture streaming, then Graphene, their tool Granite, is amazing. It was basically the enabler for how we were technically able to do Everest on an 8 gig memory budget. So basically using their approach for memory compression and streaming, we got basically 8 gigs down to 1 gig in terms of the actual texture video memory needed on the GPU. And you can kind of see some of the ways in which they do their tiling and compression and kind of reordering of the data. And it's a great solution. If you're thinking about, near photoreal or very texture-heavy games or content, highly recommend it. Lighting snow is hard. We're fortunate that Reiner, our creative director, is a very good art director. So he used, heavy Fresnel, both on diffuse and specularity, to approximate, massive snow subsurface scattering and reflections, which is critical to, do snow and ice. And so we use basically a skylight for indirect specular lighting, because you need that to make realistic snow. And this is just a quick example, of the buildup of actually the Hillary step. So you can see sort of how the composition of the scene was done. Tips on Unreal 4 optimizations: turn everything off. Basically, you can do an early Z-pass. Everything else you have to switch off. If you have a guy who made video games back in the 90s, he's worth his weight in gold in VR. All the old tricks and things that we used to do before I had the luxury of very heavy GPUs, we're all using in VR now. Fortunately, Epic is doing some cool stuff with a new forward renderer, which is improving performance. So we're getting actually a much more interesting VR renderer from them now, which is available. So highly recommend looking into that. So what did we end up with at the end of this this crazy journey? Just want to show you a mixed reality video that we created this summer, just to try and capture the experience itself. These are students from a university in Iceland who are basically trying VR for the first time. And on that note, I'll take some questions if anyone wants to ask any questions about how we made this thing or any of the technical aspects. One thing I would say is kind of a sum up: if you're an Unreal Engine developer, stay on main branch. Don't fork from Epic. If you can avoid third-party plugins, probably avoid them, because the pace of updates and development on the engine is so fast because of all the advancements that are happening around VR, that you want to stay on the standard engine. So that would be like the #1 tip if you're getting into VR development. Just stay with the standard engine. Don't do a lot of proprietary stuff or add a lot of plugins into it. So if anyone has any questions, I'd love to take some.
I'm going to be impolite and ask the first question, but I'm just so very curious. A lot of people are talking about virtual tourism nowadays. Obviously, you must have thought about that. And that would mean that you have thought much farther than just the Mount Everest. Like, how does this technology generalize? How does it scale? Like, could I use something like this and comfortably explore, I don't know, the Côte d'Azur or Tuscany or so? Or is it more for these completely unique, mind-blowing
Right.
Everest kind of experiences?
Right, good question. So I guess a couple of answers on that. I mean, Google obviously have Google Earth VR, which is pretty amazing, but has quite low resolution texture data. So it doesn't achieve the kind of near photorealistic look that we set out to do with Everest. I would be lying if I said that you can pick up Agisoft or something from Autodesk and do stereo photogrammetry and make it look this beautiful. You really need a production team that has mastered the technique. There is a lot of cleanup work and kind of fixing holes and so on that you have to do in the production itself. But still, relative to actually trying to recreate a real-world location using other techniques, photogrammetry is an awesome hack. So if you have a team that can actually work this out, it means basically, and we know this is happening now, there is a virtual land grab of companies and teams flying around the world, doing photogrammetry capture of places like the Great Wall of China, these iconic kind of locations around the world. And I think that we'll see a lot of this from particularly the media companies and some of the developers that are kind of going into kind of a application category that sits outside of core gaming, basically. So we'll see a lot more of this, but you'll see probably a handful of premium productions at this level, and then a lot of content, obviously, from Google through Earth and kind of more low-res approaches.
Hi. What did you do in terms of sound in your VR experience? Did you try to record on the Everest some wind, or what was your audio pipeline and engine you used?
So we didn't do audio recording at Everest. When we were making the project, we didn't have the budget to go to Nepal and basically record ambient sound. So we did what game developers do, and we approximated it. We used positional audio, which is a key thing that you really want to use in a VR development project, just to give that basic sense of the spatialization of the audio. And a few things that we learned along the way. Audio is absolutely critical to the sense of immersion and the sense of believability of the environment. So some of the things that we do, for example, in a couple of very fraught reversal scenes like the Kumbo Icefall or Hillary Step, we actually have heavy breathing that you hear in the headset. And it kind of picks up pace slightly. And we noticed in our testing that we were actually generating fear or flight response, obviously from vertigo, but their heart rate started going up and increasing in cue with the audio that was basically playing back. So, audio is absolutely critical. If you can afford it in terms of your overall technical budget, do some of the high-end 3D positional stuff, but basic positional is absolutely critical to a production.
Hi, I'd like to know, how do you handle long walks? Is there any long walk over in this VR thing?
Right.
Or if it is, how did you handle that?
Mm-hmm. Right. So if you were hiking to Everest Summit in the real world, it would be a hike of a few weeks, going back and down and acclimatizing and so on. Obviously, we didn't do that. We did a series of first-person scenes that were kind of key vignettes or key iconic moments of the hike. We use room-scale tracking on Vive. The largest play area that we can, but it scales down to standing, even seated on Oculus. And we use the conventional mechanic that everyone has kind of gravitated toward, which is a teleport and blink. So that's how we allow you to basically move along larger scenes. And particularly one of the modes that we're updating actually next week is what we call the scalable God mode. It's actually the full quality asset of the mountain, where you can scale from human scale, 1-to-1 resolution, all the way up to 1,500 meters to 1, and then teleport around the entire mountain range. At 1-to-1 scale, it takes you a long time to just teleport all the way from base camp up to the top. So you can do the whole thing and follow some of the historical climbing routes that we've actually mapped onto the mountain. But yeah, teleport and blink is that's become the convention that a lot of developers have just settled on.
Have you experienced a lot of players just feeling really cold when doing the experience?
Yeah, good question. We see behavior when people are experiencing Everest. A lot of first-time VR users, their introduction to high immersion VR is something like Everest, and we actually see, anecdotally, some, people, for example, talking about the color of their boots when they come out of the experience. There are no feet in the simulation. There's a guy who tried this at a conference a few months ago, and he was talking about the color and texture of his boots. His brain had just mapped that into his, into his simulation. And we couldn't convince him that there weren't actually boots. So yeah, people fill in the blanks. I mean, that's the beauty of VR. You don't have to do, accurate, full simulation. Obviously, if we had fans that we could ship as accessories and, cool the area, that would be cool. But the thing we see most often is actually an adrenaline response, like a fear of fight or flight response, based on a sense of vertigo in the experience. So if you suffer from a fear of heights, this is a terrifying experience. And we do allow you to skip past it, and it's very, very visceral when people try it, suffer from a fear of heights.
As Wendelin has mentioned already, the virtual tourism is a very interesting thing to happen in the future. But what I see now is that we have only very static touristic spaces modeled in virtual reality.
Right.
So maybe it's a kind of technological limitation. So we have the Chinese Wall, we have the Everest, we have a desert, we have temples, we have so static architecture, and nothing is happening there. But actually, tourism is not only going to a desert place, which has advantages because I feel alone, I feel like the only tourist, which is sometimes great, but tourism is also traveling to a crowded area, traveling to urban landscapes where we have movement, where we have interaction.
Yeah.
What about interaction?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. So I'm not a big believer in 360 VR. It's not really using the medium to its full potential. So with Everest VR, we created, interactive sequences where you actually are in the role of a climber who is doing key iconic moments in terms of the hike. And it's interactive. You have a sense of player agency. You have a sense of actually, mastering something you find quite emotionally challenging in terms of fear of height and so on. And 360 just has a drawback. I mean, most of us in the industry know that, as Chet said yesterday, a static point of view doesn't change. Yes, you can capture places around the world, but there's no agency. So the sense of presence, after you've kind of gone through the novelty of 360 and seeing the Great Wall of China, this is probably dating me, but it all feels like QuickTime VR to me. The real VR will be done in synthetic environments in modern game engines.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was really great. I loved the experience as well. Can you tell us a bit about what you considered when people would actually go up the mountain and would be able to fall off? Because you can't, right? And,
no. So when we were conceiving of Everest, this is not a game. So there's no kind of death scenario. We chose not to have you fall in VR. We could obviously blink and fade you quickly if you step off a ladder or off a ledge. In practice, what we found is that the only people that break the boundaries, the visual boundaries of the simulation, are other game developers. 90% of people that we've seen go through Everest, they follow the rules that they believe in. And people like that. They like following the rules of a visual simulation like this, except game developers. They all step off immediately and try and figure out where
That's the first thing I did.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. I think I'm out of time. So thank you very much. Just a pleasure to be here, and I'll take some questions afterwards if you want. Thank you.